let's jump into this stuff. Or back into it, I should say. So you've read the 3 cases, you've looked at this regulation. I handed around this little chart, which is a summary of the regulations. I think it's also on the website. If it's not, I will upload it. But it goes through and kind of talks about what is and is not included within the jurisdictional waters. So the current status on that rule, just so everybody's super clear on that, rule was promulgated on June 29th, become effective on August 28th. Became effective on the 28th of August, and just over a month later, October 9th, the Sixth Circuit stayed that rule while the Sixth Circuit heard the action, heard the complaint, trying to get that rule invalidated. That's been pending, was pending when Trump came into office. And Trump has issued an executive order telling the Corps of Engineers and the EPA they need to relook at this rule, and they put out a proposal to withdraw this rule and essentially go back to having no rule-based guidance, just going back to relying on the existing court decisions. And the comment period on that rule just closed, I think it was last week, maybe a week and a half ago. So that rule is currently being taken under advisement, part of the informal rulemaking process, as you all remember. They've got to go through, consider comments on that rule, and then decide how to go forward. This raises all kinds of really interesting administrative law issues, some really interesting environmental law issues, really none of which we're going to get into very much. But there's a lot of science behind the rule that the EPA promulgated, behind this Clean Water Act rule. And so the question is, what does an agency do when they change their definition of a piece of legislation, and there's requirements for what an agency has to do when it changes its mind, how that changes the amount of deference they get, and it's much tougher to change your mind as an agency when there's a lot of science out there that you already relied on. So now the question is, with that same science still in play, how much can the agency really change its mind without being arbitrary and capricious in doing that? So we'll probably see a challenge go up to the Supreme Court just based on that standard of review question fairly quickly. And that would be a really interesting one to watch. But that's the current status. It's been stayed, and it looks like it will probably be withdrawn fairly soon. So we'll go through these kind of fairly quickly for the older minor cases. Riverside Bayview, Corps of jurisdiction. A Corps has jurisdiction to regulate and require permits for discharge of fill material. No reason this would be any different for any other pollutants. So fill material or other pollutants into wetlands adjacent to. And this is directly adjacent to. So if we've got, I'll do it sideways so it looks bigger. We've got our big navigable waterway. So kind of what we think of as traditionally navigable. And these things always have wetlands kind of all alongside them. So little wetlands in there, an old oxbow wetland over here. These guys are all going to be adjacent, right? Both of those. This one, maybe not so much. Maybe there's surface water connections still going back and forth, but these guys are adjacent. This is what we're talking about in Riverside, Bayview. And when it was decided, it just said, hey, these are definitely covered. It's tricky figuring out where that line is between water and not water, between water and land, but we're definitely going to cover them. And Rapanos recasts this to say there's definitely this kind of nexus, the significant nexus that we require under Rapanos for these wetlands. Does that make sense to everybody? This is a classic, like the Supreme Court doesn't want to overrule itself, doesn't want to say it's a new standard. And so when you read Kennedy's concurrence, which is in the end the controlling part of Rapanos, we can talk about why that is here in a second, Kennedy goes out of his way to tie Rapanos' significant nexus back into these other cases. And says, hey, all the way back in Riverside Bayview, we use the word significant nexus. That doesn't mean they were creating a new test called significant nexus, but that's what Kennedy says Rapanos. In Rapanos, Kennedy says that's what Riverside Bayview means. And same thing in Swank, right, our next one here, which is an isolated wetland a long way away. And this isn't even a natural wetland, so we'll make it a square. It's an old strip pit kind of thing where they're going to put trash, right? And so this is Swank. Totally isolated, no surface flow, no suggestion that there's a groundwater flow. There's birds that visit both of them, so maybe you could argue based on the birds there's significant nexus. Definitely, we were just chatting about this. Under the Migratory Bird Act, This was the migratory bird rule, but it was a rule within the Clean Water Act, not under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which is a separate piece of legislation. You could probably get it upheld that way, but not the argument they made here. And so this part of the Clean Water Act was, or this rule under the Clean Water Act was struck down. Navigable has to mean something. Super close decision, right? 5-4. Scalia, Kennedy is in that majority. So under any reading, we know from Swank that this is outside of that significant nexus. That an isolated wetland like this cannot have a significant nexus to that traditionally navigable waterway. All good with that? All right. So then we get into this mess. It's not even 414, it's actually 4114, right? Because we've got Roberts writing an opinion too. And so we've got the plurality, which has 4, and we have the dissent, which also has 4. So if you've got 4 for both of those, why is one the plurality and one the dissent? How do we make that a decision about who gets to be the plurality and who gets to go first, right? Kind of a big deal. And who gets to be the dissent there? Yeah.
Just because he joined the plurality, right?
So is he part of the plurality? Does he agree with their?
No.
No.
Judgment, right?
He concurs in the judgment, meaning he agrees that we should vacate and remand. Different reasoning, right? And so there's not a plurality for the reasoning here, but there's a majority. There's a plurality for the reasoning, but there's not a majority for the reasoning. There's a majority just for the outcome. Does everybody get that? Okay, so when we start breaking down kind of what the lines look like here, we've got the dissent. We're going back to Venn diagrams. Does everybody remember Venn diagrams? Yeah? Okay. So this is Venn diagrams. This is like, I don't know, junior high, grade school. These are all the waters the dissent thinks are the waters of the United States. It's a big bubble. Within that, somewhat smaller than that, there's a set of waters that Kennedy thinks are the waters of the United States, right? And the dissent says, towards the end of the dissent actually says, hey, anything that Kennedy thinks is a water of the United States, we also think is a water of the United States. So that means Kennedy has at least 5 votes for anything that Kennedy says is a water of the United States. Everybody good with that? Okay. And then we also have our plurality, which is somewhere in here, maybe with a little bit sticking out. There might be something that they'd call waters of the United States that Kennedy wouldn't. It's not super clear. But this is our plurality stuck down here. And the dissent also says anything the plurality thinks is a water of the United States, where you would agree is definitely a water of the United States. We don't agree with the reasoning. We would say a lot more if it's in there. But if you're the EPA or the Corps of Engineers, and you've got a water that's in Kennedy or in this plurality, either one of those, you're going to count that as a water of the United States because you know you're going to have 5 votes when you get to the Supreme Court agreeing that at least 5 votes, right, maybe more, saying that that is in fact a water of the United States. Does that make sense to everybody? So anything that fits under Kennedy or anything that fits under that plurality is going to be defined as a water of the United States. So that's essentially our holding. Most of the time, Kennedy's is a little bit broader, so most of the time we just look at Kennedy's when we're analyzing whether it's a water of the United States or not. But if it failed Kennedy, you'd still want to say, does it somehow fit under the plurality? They seem really focused on surface flow, so maybe if it had some small amount of surface flow, but not as much as what Kennedy would require for a significant nexus, then you could be a water of the United States. Not super clear. I don't think we've seen any cases where the plurality would control there. The other part of this that's worth talking about that a lot of folks have discussed is we have this separate concurrence from Roberts, who's part of that plurality. What does Roberts say? Hello. I'll put my jacket on there. So what does Roberts say on this whole thing? Does Roberts have a different view of what the waters of the United States are? It's short, right? Does Roberts give us a new test or anything?
No.
Go ahead.
No. Never mind.
You started. It's too late. No, you've stepped into the ring. The spotlight is on you. Go for it.
I'm not setting the light. say about the whole situation.
Yeah, exactly.
He basically says that he just wags his fingers at the court for
Mhm.
not promulgating the rule, and that if they had promulgated a rule like they had been asked to do, or it had been suggested that they do previously, that the court likely would have sided with them because of Chevron deference.
He doesn't say all that. We're reading a little bit of that in there, right? But why even mention that if part of it isn't going to be, we'd find a way to uphold this rule? Okay, so if they'd written a rule, then we have Roberts saying we'd probably uphold that, right? And then you've got the whole dissent that's going to be on board with it. We don't know about anybody else, but we've got Roberts, we've got the dissent. That's at least 5. Maybe we get Kennedy in there too. That's at least 6. This looks very different all of a sudden. Okay? So if we have 6 votes for whatever that rule is, we've got a 6-3 majority. That's a very clear holding as opposed to this 4-1-1-4 kind of mess that we end up with, right? And so this is one of the things that you'll hear scholars talk about with Chevron. When you have a court making a Chevron ruling and they either rule in step 1 that is clear what the law says, or when there's not a rule for them to defer to, they tend to constrain the actions the agency can take in the future. Right now we have Kennedy saying this is what the Clean Water Act covers. There's not, yes, this agency's reading of the rule is okay. It's, I'm going to tell you what's covered by the Clean Water Act. That's a very different thing for a court to do, and that means any future ruling is going to have to, or any future rule rather, is going to have to contend with what Kennedy has said the law actually means. It almost imposes a Chevron step 1 reading on the law itself. Everybody make sense? Everybody good with that? Okay. So Roberts offered a way out, said, hey, you should have done this, you didn't. Not clear Roberts is really being totally honest, because Roberts joins in the plurality part where they say, we don't really want to give Chevron deference to a really important constitutional question like this. So who knows what Roberts would actually have done, but that's what Roberts is saying anyway. But the Kennedy significant nexus test is the controlling part that we come out with here. And Kennedy tells us that wetlands have that requisite nexus to come within the phrase navigable waters if the wetlands, either alone or in combination with other similarly situated lands in the region, significantly affect the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of covered waters more readily understood as navigable. That should be really familiar. Significantly affect the chemical, physical, and biological integrity. Anybody remember where that comes from? It shows up in Riverside. Okay. Why does it keep showing up in all these Clean Water Act cases? What's the common thread? It comes from the act itself. So we're close. Let's go back. Oh no. Thank you. I appreciate that. You're saving the photo shoot. All right. So you can go all the way back.
Show me Magnum.
You're killing me.
Yes.
All right. There we go. So the objective of the act, to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the waters. So the goal of the act is really what Kennedy's looking at here. And if you're a textualist, this maybe doesn't fit very well, but this is Kennedy's big thing. It's like, what's the purpose of this act? Let's make sure that the jurisdiction of the act matches up with the purpose of the act. Right, so Kennedy's test then is there a significant nexus between this water and the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of what we generally would think of as navigable waters. And that's also the same thing, so in this little handout we've got, those shaded waters are waters traditionally thought of as navigable. And so everything else is evaluated with how they relate to those waters. It's gonna take me like 5 minutes to get back to the right slide here. All right, so there's Kennedy's test. One of the key things here, though, is that we're not looking at wetlands by themselves necessarily. It can also be in combination with similarly situated wetlands or lands in the region. That means if we're talking about a wetland, you know, this little guy right here, we look at all of these different, these are called oxbow lakes, as they're above. And it's from where the river moved back and forth originally, and they leave little isolated wetlands. So if you're doing this test, you don't just look at at this wetland right here, you look at all of the wetlands that are like that wetland in the region and say, based on the relationships between all of these guys and this traditionally navigable river, is there that significant nexus? And that means you're able to amalgamate all of the impacts from all of these guys. You can add up all of those impacts. Yeah.
So Scalia's pluralities view would be more, it would just be one specific wetland on this map, and you had trace some type of interconnected.
Yeah, they look at one and they really look for that surface water connection, right? And we were talking about this earlier, Sean and I and a couple other folks. If you think about where we are, and if you think about the rivers that you drive over during the summer, so you're driving up and down the Central Valley on the I-5, water in those rivers? Not always. If they're a canal, for sure, right? If they're moving water around for irrigation, there'll be water there. But if it's like a natural river, you go look at Cache Creek during the summer. You go down to Southern California, look at the Santa Maria River. It's a half a mile wide, and 95% of the year, there's not water in that stream. So there's definitely a geographic kind of view where the majority is mostly judges from the East Coast, mostly judges from places that have enough rain that the rivers stay full year-round. So they think about a river in a very different way than the way that we think about a river out here. And you get Kennedy, who taught at McGeorge. He's from Sacramento originally. He has a very Western sensibility. And so he gets that a river, and this is kind of my view on the whole thing, he gets that a river doesn't have to have water in it. He gets that there doesn't have to be that surface water connection. And it's still really important. If you put, you put stuff into the Santa Maria River, you put stuff into Cache Creek this time of year when it's totally dry, as soon as the rain starts, you're washing all those pollutants downstream. So if you really want to protect those systems, Kennedy's view, I think, fits much better with protecting kind of what we view as our rivers here. On the other hand, it's much harder because it's not a clear line test. All right, so Kennedy then gives us the contrast. When wetlands' effects on water quality are speculative or insubstantial, they fall outside of the statutory term navigable waters, right? So if there are speculative or insubstantial impacts, we don't include those. And this is where the fight is then. When do we have a significant nexus, and when do we just have speculative or insubstantial impacts? How big an area do we kind of combine the impacts from in order to figure out if we have that kind of tie or not? Kennedy goes on and tells us, kind of as we said, post hoc, Riverside Bayview, we know for adjacent waters, these are definitely going to have that ecological interconnection. I mean, it makes sense. They're rearing grounds for, if you've been to a wetland, for frogs, for small fish, all those things. This is the part where Kennedy follows in Robert's footsteps and is kind of asking for a rulemaking. So where an adequate nexus is established for a particular wetland, it may be permissible as a matter of administrative convenience or necessity to presume covered status for other wetlands in the region. You could make a rule to decide that based on finding this one wetland is covered, that all wetlands that are like this wetland are also covered. And that's what the EPA did in the rulemaking we have summarized here. They went through and for each of these different areas said that, so under A8, section A8, they go through and they say waters located in a 100-year floodplain or within 4,000 feet of a high tide line or ordinary high water mark, and then give us a bunch of different categories, some of which are just saying across the board, anytime you have this kind of situation, it's going to be covered. They did that with vernal pools here in California. All vernal pools in California are covered, period. That's just what the rule says. Based on analyzing the science, analyzing kind of what a traditional, typical vernal pool looks like, those waters are always going to be covered. Make sense to everybody? And that's why you want to have this rule. Yeah.
So then just the A8 is just a more of a broad right line test rather than the E7?
Yeah, so that's exactly right. So under A8, we're taking these particular waters and saying for all of these, we're going to cover them, right? We're definitely going to say they fall in. For A7, some are going to be covered, and then some of them are going to have to be considered on a case-specific basis. And so you have to read through all of A7 to figure out which ones are case-specific and which ones are all covered. But the goal is to kind of carve as much off as possible so that there's not this kind of constant discretion needed. Let's go out and figure out if this particular wetland is covered or not. Cool. All right. Yeah.
Hold off on forgetting where's groundwater fall into all this?
So groundwater is kind of an open question. It's definitely not a water of the United States, so we don't cover it. The question about whether a groundwater connection is enough to treat it like a surface water connection is really generally pretty open. Clearly, the plurality wouldn't do it. I think Kennedy would probably be okay with it, but there's actually a case. I don't think it was somebody in this class, but there's a case on the East Coast dealing with this exact question right now, and so we should be hearing something about that in the next, I don't know, 6 months to a year, so somewhere in there. Many of you found this diagram, which I think is the best diagram out there. So swamp waters, totally isolated, Riverside Bayview, adjacent to navigable in fact, and then all of this mess up here where you get into the headwaters, you get into really small streams, lots of wetlands. Any of these places, we don't really know. Any of those places, it's a case-by-case basis. Is this enough of a significant nexus to count? Right, we aren't going to know. Most places that streams start are kind of wetlands themselves, and so knowing whether those wetlands are covered or not is it's really going to depend on the Corps of Engineers person who's out looking at the thing for you, deciding for you whether it's covered or not. All right, we talked about 63 months in prison, hundreds of thousands of dollars in criminal fines that Rapanos was facing. Seems really terrible until you read about what Rapanos had done, right, before this whole thing kicked off. He had a consultant come in, and the consultant told him he had 48 to 58 acres of wetlands. He threatened to destroy the consultant unless he eradicated all traces of his report. And then he had land movers come in, earth movers, and for $350,000, he filled in 22 of the 64 acres of wetlands on one of his sites. Did this with no permit, and did this in spite of getting cease and desist orders from the state officials and the EPA. So he went forward and destroyed, I think, total close to 70 acres of wetlands. Other interesting thing, what year was Rapanos decided? You know what year the whole thing started, when he first started trying to develop these wetlands? 1990. 16 years to get to Supreme Court. And it didn't get decided there, right? They kicked it back down, goes on remand, and finally he settles on remand. He paid $150,000 directly to the U.S. He completed $750,000 to create an off-site wetland, roughly 100 acres, and he donated the mitigation properties to a third party to watch over them, funded mitigation endowment of $25,000, and permanently preserved the 34 acres of wetlands at one of his sites, 100 acres at another of his sites that he had not yet destroyed. And he agreed to respect the state delineations of wetlands. So that was the, I guess I'll follow the law now. Yeah, and that is it. So that was his ultimate resolution of the case. I think it's always worth tracking down what finally happened. Not easy to do, but that's a good, it probably took a lot of, yeah, for him,
For 16.
huge, yeah. It's good to get a client like that. A rich and really dedicated client is good stuff.
Who's doing like absolutely the same stupid thing.
That's, yeah,
It's never gonna stay out of trouble.
it's perfect. All right, so let's go back to the elements. We haven't talked about all this other stuff yet, but we've talked, I think, to death now about jurisdictional waters. So clearly this is going to be a key part of it. I'm likely to ask you questions about this on the final. It's going to be an area that's going to be kind of continuing to evolve. So let's think just for a moment about what like a good exam answer looks like for a question like this. Why do we even get in? How do we get into this jurisdictional question? What's the starting point for all this? What does the Clean Water Act say it covers? To the navigable waters, right? So discharge to navigable waters, then from that we say navigable equals waters, WOTUS, waters of the United States. What WOTUS means has been discussed in at least 3 Supreme Court cases. Give the name for all 3 of those, right? These are just like, it's like you're playing pinball and you're answering these questions. You're just dinging all these things. This gets points, these names all get points. And depending on what the fact setup is, it's probably not gonna be similar to SWONK because SWONK's a super easy case, it's totally isolated. So you say SWONK doesn't really apply. Based on the other 2 cases, we need a significant nexus, and we know that a significant nexus from the first case includes adjacent, right? And so you kind of do a little rule development there, and all of this kind of falls under rule development. Under rule development, and then you go through the specific facts you've got and apply that rule. But this is a big spot for picking up points. The ultimate decision that you come to, whether this is a water of the United States or not super key to the points you're going to get on the question. It's being able to do that analysis and compare them to these other cases that you've seen. Does that make sense to everybody? Hopefully this should be reviewed to you at this point, but that's kind of where I would expect a question like this to start. Okay, so other things, by a person. Person means, under the language of the Clean Water Act, individual, corporation, partnership, association, state, municipality, commission, or political subdivision of a state, or any interstate body. So basically anything you can think of is going to be covered as a person under the Clean Water Act. Addition is not defined in the Clean Water Act, but the case law generally says the conveyance of any non-natural conveyance of any pollutant to a water body, even if the water body already has the particular pollutant in question. So adding mercury to a river that has mercury doesn't mean you're not covered. The fact that it's already polluted doesn't save you there. Even if you're taking water out of that river into a cup and dumping it back out into the river, at that point you're discharging mercury into the river. Okay? The case on this one, and I did not have you all read this, I figured you had enough, but if you do want to go back and check it out, it's on page 716. The case is Du Bois v. U.S. Department of Agriculture, and that's a Forest Service case. We've got a ski operator who's discharging pollutants into this little pond. It's a 19-acre pond, 65 feet deep, and it's the water supply for a nearby town. So Loon Corporation operates a ski slope up around this area. They pull water out of a tributary to this lake, use that water, some of that water to flush their ski machines, some of it to generate snow, and then they discharge some of that water that they flush through their machines back into the lake. The water doesn't seem to be any dirtier when they put things back into the lake. And so the question was, if we're just taking water out and then putting water right back into the lake, where the water would have ended up anyway, is that a discharge or not? And the court says, yes, in fact, it is a discharge. They do need a permit because naturally, the way that this happened wouldn't happen. It wouldn't happen in the same volume, wouldn't happen at the same places, at the same time. And once they've taken that water out of the waters of the United States, taken that water out of the stream, it's no longer part of the waters of the United States, and it's now their responsibility when they're discharging it back into the lake. Most permits have allowances. You'll see when we go to the hatchery, there's tons of mercury in all the rivers around here, right? That's just kind of a natural background pollutant. So the permit for the fish hatchery says that they're allowed to discharge mercury at the background rate. So they can't add mercury, but if there's already mercury in the water, they're not being forced to remove that mercury from the water. All right. The other one, oh, yeah.
In that case, is just like a discharge of anything more than it naturally happens.
Exactly. So if something wouldn't happen naturally, wouldn't happen in the same way naturally, then it becomes a discharge. And then once you remove something from the environment, putting it back in, even if it's exactly the same thing that you just removed, that is a discharge. And we've got a case that follows on that, which is U.S. v. Deaton. This is a side casting case. So here we've got a wetland with really it's a field with a wetland in the middle of it. It looks like some Canadian geese are on there, because why not? So they wanted to drain this. The farmer goes in and just uses a backhoe to scoop out the dirt all the way along to drain the water out of that wetland. And then the dirt that's scooped up is side casted. It's thrown out to either side. Back onto the farm itself. This is literally the dirt that they just picked up. They throw it off on the sides. Okay, this is a wetland, clearly, and wetlands are, in this particular case, this wetland is covered by the Clean Water Act. That's a jurisdictional water, and so scooping the dirt out here and throwing it back in on either side. The question was, is that a discharge? Is that prohibited by? Is that an addition? Right, that makes it a discharge, and thus prohibited by the act. And the court says that yes, as soon as you scoop it up, right, as soon as you lift this stuff up and put it back in on either side, that's still going to be an addition, even though it's the exact same stuff that we just saw.
You
All
don't
right.
have to be putting it back into the actual
The water body is going to be defined as much bigger than where the surface water is on a wetland like that. It's where the water is at this point, but absent the ripping during different parts of the year, the water's going to come all the way up. They look at soil conditions. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we do the wetlands lecture. Yeah.
How far out of the water does it actually have to go before it constitutes a reproduction?
As soon as you pick, that's a good question. As soon as you pick it up, there's actually a Ninth Circuit case on that I'll take us to in just 1 second. The court on this one said that once it's picked up, it's no longer dirt that's part of the natural environment. All of a sudden now it's dredged spoil because it's in the loader of your bucket. And so when you throw it back in, now you're throwing dredged spoil in, you're making an addition to the waters of the United States. And then the next one is a California case, Borden Ranch v. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I can't ever say this guy's name right. Sakopoulos? Is that am I saying it correctly? Tsakopoulos. Big landowner, does lots of litigation. He's one of these very principled litigators who's happy to take any case he can to the Supreme Court. Yeah, as you said, a litigator's dream guy. So this is over by Lodi, is where Borden Ranch is. You can buy the Borden Ranch Zinfandel. I haven't tried it. I'm sure it's lovely. But the area where this farming is going on has a hard pan under the soil surface. So we've got soil surface, dirt, pebbles, rocks, and then way down here is a hard clay layer. So water comes down to this layer and cannot go through it. Okay, this layer is stopping any of the water from getting through. Means that if this is in a basin, you'll get pooling up here. You tend to get salt issues as the water comes down and then evaporates off. It leaves little salts in the sand. And if you plant plants here, if you've got a grapevine with a gnarly root coming down, the roots have a really hard time getting through that. And so they can't be deeply rooted plants. You want your plant to have a nice deep taproot, right, for your grapevines. Not a cantaloupe. That's a grapevine. All right, so you want it to go down. To do that, you have to go through and you do what's called deep ripping. There's a giant plow. This is maybe 18 inches to 2 feet, up to 5 or 6 feet in some cases. And so you get your I wish I could draw a tractor to scale here. There's a big hook that comes down off the back of this, and as you drive through, this hook tears out that layer, just rips that layer out, just cuts it. You're not actually taking it out of the ground. It's just enough to cut through that, create openings where those roots can go down all the way through, where the water can move through. So that's called deep ripping. Ninth Circuit gets this case. The question is deep ripping, this goes to your exact question, we're not lifting this stuff even out of the ground. We're not picking it up at all. But when we deep rip, here's a front view of the blade of the deep ripper here, and this is in the ground, and there's dirt coming off either side of this blade. Is this helpful? Does this make sense at all?
Absolutely.
That's good.
It's entertaining.
Okay. There we go. So this is the underground portion of it. There's just stuff spilling off either side, just like from a regular plow. The question is this an addition? And the Ninth Circuit says, yeah. It says that counts as an addition, brings this whole thing subject to the Clean Water Act. Yeah?
Where's the water in all this?
It's because these tend to be vernal pool areas where you have this thing there. So you're deep ripping a vernal pool, the vernal pool goes away. And so if you can deep rip it and get rid of the vernal pool without discharging anything, without adding an addition under the Clean Water Act, then probably the Clean Water Act couldn't protect these vernal pools. So that's the problem that the Ninth Circuit was wrestling with, and probably why they came down this direction. The Supreme Court is evenly divided on this issue, and so because they had a 4-4 split, and one justice had to recuse, we don't get a new decision. Ninth Circuit decision stands, right? So this is still considered to be discharge of a pollutant, addition of a pollutant. Yeah.
Was this a vineyard before, or was this open ground?
This was not a vineyard yet. Wanted to turn it into a vineyard. And you can. So the other part of this is that we haven't touched this stuff yet, but there's tons of exemptions within the Clean Water Act for ag. So if you have ag going on our property already, you can keep deep ripping, you can keep plowing, even if there's a wetland there. It doesn't matter as long as that was the use that was the use of the ground when the Clean Water Act was passed. And so we'll talk more about the ag exemptions later on. But this was bringing what was fallow land with these vernal pools on it into production. Okay. Questions on that? So that covers addition. So we've got addition, we've got jurisdictional elements, we've got person here. Next, we have pollutant. So pollutant under the Act means dredge spoil, solid waste, incinerator residue, sewage, garbage, sewage sludge, munitions. So if you shoot at the ground, that can bring you under the Clean Water Act. Clean water, chemical wastes, biological materials, radioactive materials, heat, wrecked or discarded equipment, so your old truck. Think about all the levees you see where there's just cars parked down into the river. It's more of a Midwestern thing than a California thing, but a lot of the big rivers have these trucks parked all along the edge to try and armor it. That's a discharge under the Clean Water Act, or a pollutant rather, under the Clean Water Act. Rock, sand, cellar dirt, and industrial, municipal, and agricultural waste discharged into water. Super broad definition of pollutant there. And that's the language of the Act itself. All right, basically anything you could think to put into water is going to be covered, is going to be a pollutant under the Clean Water Act. Very broad. There are a couple of exceptions here. I put these, I get so fancy, and then I just want them to come up. Sewage from vessels are not covered. That's covered under a separate program, also under the Clean Water Act, but under a different part. Not 402, not 404. It's actually the Coast Guard and the EPA that do that, and that's section 313. We aren't going to cover that in this class really at all. Discharge incidental to normal operations of armed forces and oil and gas production. So oil and gas production is generally not covered by the Clean Water Act. They are exempted from that. Kind of gives you an idea of how powerful that lobby was. There's also a lot of exemptions that we'll see for farming, as I said, but we'll come back to those later. All right, so that's pollutants. Addition, pollutant, jurisdictional water. The rest of it fell off by a person. All right, so point source is the next point. The next part in this, rather, has to come from a point source. The easy way to remember a point source is that it's a source that you can point to and say, hey, that's where it's coming into the water. So if you can point to it, it's probably a point source. Point source in the definition means it's coming out of a distinct point someplace. End of a pipe is the easiest example, right? You've got a pipe, it's spilling pollutants out. You can point to it, it's coming out of a single point. That's where the pollution comes from. Language from the Act says pipe, ditch, channel, tunnel, conduit, well, discrete fissure, so like a crack in the earth, container, rolling stock, so think railroad stock, that has stuff dripping out of it, concentrated animal feeding operation, a CAFO, or vessel or other floating craft. So all of those are point sources. This is where we get the agricultural stormwater discharge exemption. So any ag stormwater and any return flows from irrigated agriculture are not considered point sources, even if they're coming out of a ditch or a pipe from a farm. So they're exempted there.
Is that a court-made exemption? Because they determined that ski resorts can just put water back in water, but it's okay for agricultural purposes.
So this is actually in the Act itself, and it's based on the Farm Bureau lobbying during the passage of the Act, which is why it was such a weird thing that the ag folks were fighting so hard against the Clean Water Act rule, when most of what they were kind of using for that campaign is things that wouldn't get covered anyway, because they were already exempted. So non-point sources are not defined, but essentially it's anything not a point source. The big things that you think of when you think about this is runoff. Any runoff from, let's say, a golf course, from your house when you put fertilizer down and the rain comes, from a forest after you cut down a bunch of trees and the rain comes in and washes sediment into the streams. Any kind of discharges generally tied to land use is what you think of when you think of non-point sources. And the reasoning behind this is that the states have a traditional role in controlling land use, and the feds weren't trying to usurp that role. They wanted states to stay in that traditional position. And so we're going to let states deal with these non-point sources and not try and cover them with the Clean Water Act. Turns out not a great decision, because almost all of our pollution now comes from non-point sources, but that was the thought when we passed the Clean Water Act. All right, so different kinds of sources. Point source folks are folks who are discharging directly, publicly on treatment works, industry. We have indirect dischargers that have pre-treatment requirements. We'll come back to those next class. For any of you, anybody who's at chemistry as an undergrad? How many of you had chemistry? Some? Not a ton. Okay.
Not so
It was a long time ago.
Oh, it doesn't matter if you passed it.
Oh, well, yeah.
Okay, good, good.
That was a long time ago.
So when you're in there, they have like, you got the acetone you can spray around, or like all these cool chemicals, and then there's a little bucket next to the sink. And you're supposed to put some stuff in there, and the rest of it can go down the drain. The stuff that goes down the drain is the stuff that the university has to make sure is pre-treated correctly before it goes to publicly owned treatment work. Publicly owned treatment work can handle some acetone in the water, probably not a huge deal. If you're dealing with mercury in your chemistry lab, you don't put that down the drain because publicly owned treatment works aren't set up to handle mercury, so you've got to find another way to dispose of that. All right, so indirect dischargers is anybody else who sends their waste to a publicly owned treatment work before that waste is discharged to a river. Everybody good with that?
We had to call for, we worked for Safeway for a long time, and when we lose like a milk box or something, we would have all that liquid milk. We would call the city and the water treatment plant, and they'd give you a very specific schedule. If you had dump like 10 gallons per day was the max normally.
Interesting.
But even like dairy milk would.
Special pre-treatment requirements
You
for
had,
dairy.
yeah, and they would send someone out, and they were like, they treated it just like hazardous waste, but it's not.
There you go. That's another indirect discharger. So non-point sources, like we talked about, animal feedlots that aren't confined to animal feedlots, croplands, forests, rural homes, all those houses we talked about that have the septic tanks that aren't doing a great job, the stuff that bubbles up and then gets washed away. That's all non-point source pollution. City streets, suburban development, all of that non-point source. All right, next question. This is a case, again, I didn't assign this one, but if you're only going to read one of them, this would be the one to read. Not because it teaches you a whole lot, and not really because it's terribly relevant, but it's just fucked up. There's this guy named Villegas who runs the Plaza Health Labs, and he, like, what they do is testing for like all kinds of diseases, including hepatitis, including HIV, all of this stuff. So they've got all these vials. And Villegas, who works at Plaza Labs or runs the Plaza Labs, takes these vials of human blood that they're supposed to be testing and puts them in rocks along the side of the Hudson River. Hudson River is tidal, and so the tides would come in and lift up the bottles and carry them away. And then the lab didn't have to dispose of them. They would just get carried away. Little kids were finding these vials, like on class trips. They'd go to the river, and they'd bring up like pieces of broken vials and whole vials that still had the blood in them. So yeah, it's kind of incredible. And the question that we had, so read it for that because it's pretty excellent. So the question then is, can this person be a point source? Or is this not the kind of thing the Clean Water Act is supposed to cover? And this is kind of a typical federal prosecutors wanting to reach out and grab a hold of the sensational crime, because clearly it's got to be illegal to do this, and there should be a federal law against it, so maybe Clean Water Act's that law. So this comes to the court, and the court says this term, point source, is at least ambiguous, and then based on the criminal law doctrine of the rule of lenity. Everybody know what that is? Basically, tie goes to the runner. If we're not clear, then we didn't do a good job writing these criminal statutes, and we aren't going to punish people if the statute's not clear. So the court says it's at least ambiguous, rule of lenity, we're not going to apply it to Villegas in this particular case. The dissent would have applied it to him, would have called his car a point source, the vials themselves could have been point sources, he as a person could be a point source, but that was not the Second Circuit's majority view. So Second Circuit majority view is that a person cannot be a point source. So you're probably safe when you were peeing in the water. That actually came up in the case. The question is, are swimmers discharging bodily fluids into the water? Are they a point source within the meaning of the act? Yeah.
Couldn't they get him in his official capacity as an agent for the larger lab, as opposed to I'm just a swimmer, then you're in your personal capacity, presumably. But if you're disposing vials and you're sidestepping regulation, how are you not doing that?
Remember, it only applies if you're discharging water, or discharging a pollutant to the waters of the United States.
Yes.
And those, remember, these are our elements, and one of those elements is that you have to be a point source to even get regulated.
But
And so
you're from the laboratory. So
and that's the way the dissent would have read it, as that.
But it's not, I wouldn't, but as a person in a pool, like, you're not representing So I feel like that.
Yeah.
I'll
No, read it for sure. The dissent would agree with you, and frankly, I think you're right. I mean, you could call the lab a point source. You could call the car a point source. You could call each bottle a point source. Take your pick. But the majority there says that we're not going to include like the actions of one person like this as a point source. Yeah.
Wasn't the snagging of something like they couldn't say by a person from a person? Is there something crazy like that?
The rule of lenity got it off, but it was a pretty convoluted reading, I think, to get there.
It was like, if they wanted to make a person point source, then they wouldn't.
Right, they would have said.
To say by a person from a person, it made no sense logically.
Maybe. That's their reading of it, but I don't buy it.
I'm sure he broke another rule.
The state would definitely get them. All right, any questions over statutory triggers? Now that we've covered this for like a class and a half, basically, we're going to move into what the Clean Water Act actually says with our next class. All good? All right, good work today, folks. If the photography people are out there, they may not be. I think they may want some of you to sign releases for your pictures to be on.
I don't think you stroked your beard enough.
I didn't touch. I should touch my face more. It's true.
It's really lacking that authoritative feel.
Story of my life. Like
I would say that impressive drawing. That's gonna make the front page of Victoria's
It's good.
website right there.
Oh, I was drawing one of the groundwater pumps at one point, and drew like this pump coming up, and then a couple of the centrifugal pumps they used to do it, and then the water all coming out the top. It was like, this is a class of like 30 undergrads. I'm like, I just drew. I can hear like the clicking, as they're all taking pictures in the background.